Tonight you are exactly where you need to be. You've found your way to a quiet little corner of the night, where the world slows down, the stars begin to whisper, and soft stories drift like moonlight through the dark. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, I just want to gently ask, if you find comfort in these bedtime moments, it would mean the world if you'd take a second to like this video, subscribe, or even share it with someone else who could use a little peace. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing night after night. Now settle in, let the day melt away, and let's begin. Once upon a time there was a king of Lombardy who, though he was uglier than any of his subjects, loved beauty in others. So he married a wife who was declared by everyone to be the handsomest of women, and, whispered some, the most ill-natured also. Certainly she could not endure the sight of a pretty person, and her ladies were all the plainest of their kind. Worse than all, she was desperately jealous of the king's son and daughter by his former wife. Unfortunately, in spite of all her evil qualities, the king was her complete slave, and badly though she treated the boy, the lovely princess was made to suffer 10 times as much. Not contented with giving the girl, for a governess, a woman whose temper was as bad as the queen's own, the cruel stepmother did everything she could think of to spoil the girl's beauty, and to force her to appear as ugly as she was herself. But, try as she might, when the hideous clothes and frightful brown paint had been removed, her loveliness shone out as bright as ever. Now the King of Lombardy was cousin to the Archduke of Piacenza, who had lately lost his reason, to the great grief of his son and daughter, Per Arthrites and Ferrandina. The doctors having all failed to restore him to health, the prince and princess sent a messenger to consult a famous enchantress, called the Mother of Sheaths, because everyone who visited her brought with him a knife, which she thrust into one of the sheaths with which her cavern was lined. However, they obtained little comfort from the witch, who bade them seek their father's wits in the place where he had lost them. Against the wishes of the chief ministers, Per Arthrites and Ferrandina rode off to the mysterious castle where the king had slept when his terrible fate had overtaken him, and once inside the gates, nothing more was heard of them. When 3 weeks had passed and still there was no news, the king's chief minister called a council to talk over the matter, and at the end it was decided that a company of distinguished persons should visit the Mother of Sheaths, and that the knives they must take with them should be of pure gold, richly set with precious stones. The witch was so pleased with the beauty of the gifts that she not only listened attentively to their story, but proceeded to a hole in the cavern, from which she drew out a little case containing a comb and a steel collar fastened by a gold key. Carry this comb and the collar to every court until you find a lady beautiful enough to unlock the collar and a man good enough to draw the comb from its case. When you have discovered these, you can return whence you came." "But I do not see," said the chamberlain, "how that will help us to bring back our lost prince and princess." "It is all I can do for you," answered the mother of sheaths, and she went into the back of the cavern, where they dared not follow her. For the next few months, the Mad King's principal ministers wandered from one court to another, till at last they reached Lombardy, where they found that their story had already traveled before them. As soon as they appeared in the presence chamber, the king received them with open arms, for in his heart he had no doubt that his wife was the peerless beauty destined to unfasten the collar. And indeed, if paint and hair dye and magnificent dresses could have ensured her doing so, he would certainly have been right. But, blinded by his love for this wicked woman, he had really no idea that her charms were not her own. At the appointed hour the queen entered the throne room, having by her side the young princess in the most grievous plight imaginable. Her dress was so contrived as to give the idea that she had a hump. Her pink and white skin was thickly covered with yellow paint, and her black hair all hidden by a close-fitting brown cloth cap. Murmurs of indignation rose on all sides, and the ambassadors, who had frequently heard the princess compared to the lovely Ferrandina, were dumb with astonishment. As for the king, he could hardly raise his eyes from the ground, so ashamed was he, and signing to his son to take his place, he withdrew from the scene. Mounting the throne, the prince commanded the trial to begin at once, and the collar was handed to the princess's governess, who, being one of the ugliest women that ever was seen, naturally failed to turn the key. Seizing the chance of his being for a short time in power, the prince resolved to punish her cruelties towards his sister, and especially this last one, to which she had prompted the queen, and ordered her to be taken out and executed, which was done with great goodwill by the attendants. He then further commanded the ladies-in-waiting to attend his sister to her apartments, and bathe her and dress her in the queen's most splendid robes, as she had none of her own. And the queen, though gnashing her teeth with anger, for once dared not interfere. More quickly than could have been expected, the princess returned, looking so beautiful that if anyone had doubted before who would be able to unlock the collar, they were instantly convinced. The prince glanced at her, but said nothing, and, signing to one of the ambassadors, he ordered him to make trial of the comb. One by one, each man present did his best to remove it from its case, and one by one each was forced to own himself beaten. At length only the prince remained, but as he was the judge he must wait till the last. After the men had finished, the ladies of the court had the collar presented to them according to rank, but none could even turn the key. Finally it was handed to the queen, who managed to open it a little way. Her heart beat with triumph, but immediately it closed again with a snap, and she sank back, fainting from disappointment. By this time there were only left the prince and his sister, and no sooner did he touch the case than it opened of itself. While the lock of the collar yielded directly, the princess took hold of the key. Cries of delight rose from the courtiers and attendants, but these were interrupted by a whirlwind accompanied by thick darkness and followed by an earthquake. When all was calm again and the sun shining, the prince and princess had disappeared. Although the king's son and daughter were the only persons who had vanished in the storm, unluckily they had been carried off in opposite directions. The rapid motion through the air deprived the princess of her senses, which she nearly lost a second time from fright when she was set down alone in the middle of a thick forest. She ran wildly about, calling to her brother to come to her aid, but her cries only attracted the attention of some hungry wolves, who sprung towards her with their jaws gaping and their red tongues hanging out. Falling on her knees, she covered her face with one hand, unconsciously grasping the collar with the other, and awaited her doom. Already she could feel their hot breath on her cheek, and crouched lower and lower when the eyes of the foremost wolf caught sight of the collar. With a howl that echoed through the forest, he bounded away, followed by his companions. As soon as the princess had recovered from the shock, she rose and fled, without knowing whither, until she found herself in a broad road, and beheld, approaching her, a flock of sheep driven by 2 shepherds. She hastened towards them in order to implore their help, when suddenly the sheep caught sight of her collar and instantly scattered in all directions. "I must have something about me which frightens all beasts," she thought, and took great comfort therefrom. And in good spirits she went her way, till she came to the gates of an old castle. She was just about to enter and beg for a night's shelter, when a snow-white fox ran across the road and stopped in front of her. He was so pretty and had such bright, beseeching eyes that the princess hastily tucked the collar under her dress, lest he too should flee at the sight of it. Very gently she drew near, hoping he might follow her into the castle, but he only set off in another direction, and, tired though she was, something forced the girl to follow him. Thankful indeed was she when he turned a corner and sat down before the door of a tiny palace, which was built on the bank of a river. When she came up, he took the hem of her dress between his teeth and led her into a room where there was a table covered with milk and fruit. After she had eaten and drunk, she lay down upon a pile of cushions, with the fox at her feet, and fell asleep to dream of her lost brother. If the princess was dreaming of her brother, he was no less thinking of her on the wild seashore, whither the whirlwind had cast him. All was bleak and bare, except a green island which he could only see from the top of a high rock where he passed all his days, gazing on the waving palm trees and glittering waterfalls in the distance. Suppose she should be there, he said to himself. And though there was no reason to expect that the princess should be in that place more than in any other, he could not get the notion out of his head. A song, sung in the loveliest voice he had ever heard, roused the young man from his musings, and he instantly turned in the direction from which it had come. But though the singer seemed close to him, he could see her nowhere, and indeed, no sooner had he reached one spot than the voice sounded in another direction, and he followed it up and down, till he was suddenly stopped by the sight of a large fish's skin, which lay stretched on the sand between the sea and the rocks. The thing was so ugly that he stepped aside in disgust, and at that instant something leapt into the sea behind his back. This caused him to look round. The fish's skin was no longer there, but in a cave in the rock behind it he discovered a bath of ebony lined with gold, which glittered in the sunlight. Days passed without any adventures, and the prince had almost made up his mind to leave the shore, and to seek his sister inland, when once more he heard the voice that had so charmed him, and beheld the bloody skin lying on the sand, and the bath, now filled with water, in the grotto. Little sleep had he that night, and before dawn he hid himself behind the rocks, determined not to move from the place till the fish should come back again. He had not very long to wait, for with the first rays of the sun there appeared, out to sea, a shining white object which was blown by gentle breezes towards the shore. As it came nearer, he beheld a maiden of dazzling loveliness, seated in a shell where blues and pinks and greens all melted into each other. In her hand she held the rope with which the shell was guided. The prince was so bewildered at her beauty that he forgot that he was in hiding, and, rushing out, sank on his knees on the sands, holding out his hands towards this wonderful vision. But as he did so, the comb and its case fell out of his pocket, and at the sight the lady uttered a wild shriek, and, steering her shell round, vanished speedily in the direction of the island. Throwing off his clothes, the prince was preparing to swim after her, when he perceived beside him a snow-white fox, looking the same way, and making frantic signs with his paws, till a small boat put out and set sail towards them, to the great joy of the little creature. When the boat drew up to the beach, the fox waved his paw towards the prince's clothes, which he took to mean that he was to put them on again. This done, they both got in, and had just pushed off, when the prince suddenly recollected that the sight of the comb had frightened away the beautiful lady. In a transport of fury he raised his hand to fling it into the sea, but the fox sprang on him and held on so tightly to his arm that he could not lift it. At that moment a horseman on the shore let fly an arrow at the fox, with so true an aim that the little creature fell heavily into the well of the boat, and closed its eyes, like one who has received his death blow. The grief of the prince was sore. He instantly leapt to land, but the murderer was already far distant. When the young man turned round again, the boat and the fox were nowhere to be seen. An approaching storm drove him into the grotto, which was lighted up by a multitude of tapers, each one being in the shape of a knife half out of its sheath. Over the bath was a tent-shaped covering of white, embroidered with sheaths, and from beneath it came a voice. "Prince, will you trust me whatever happens, knowing that my heart is yours, and as I feel that yours is mine? But Beware, for if you give the smallest sign of fear, when the tent is opened, you will lose me forever." She did well to warn him, and even then he had much ado to keep the color in his cheeks and his hand from trembling, for a crocodile's head with snapping jaws advanced towards him. With a mighty effort he managed to remain still and to gaze steadily at the horrible beast, and as he did so, the head bent backwards, and beneath it was seen the lovely countenance of the Lady of the Shell. "Quick, Prince, quick! The time is flying. Comb me at once, or I shall vanish from your sight." At her words he took out the comb, but found to his surprise that it needed all his strength to draw it from its sheath. And strange to say, that in proportion as the comb emerged from its sheath, the lady's head was freed from its horrible covering, and her body rose a little more out of the water. When her shoulders and arms were freed, she called to him, "Enough! So far you have obeyed my orders. Now burn my skin." "Ah, that I can never do," cried he, but the lady cut him short. "Then we shall both rue it forever," she said gravely, "for I can only be the wife of him who will burn my skin." And while he still stood hesitating, the curtains of the tent fell back on her, and the tapers fizzled out. Bitterly repenting his slowness, he wandered towards the forest where a fire was burning, hardly knowing what he did. But on his way he almost fell over the skin, which was lying across his path. Ah, fool that I was! "This must be the skin she wished me to burn," said he, and seizing it in both hands he flung it into the fire, where it exploded with a terrific noise. At first he rushed off to some distance, not knowing what might next befall, but after a while found that his steps had led him back to the place of the fire. The skin had gone and left no traces, but among the cinders he beheld something shining, which proved to be the magic collar. Ah! Then his sister, for whom he had so greatly longed, must be near at last. And before he could turn his head or pick up the collar, her arms were round his neck, and everything else was forgotten. "You shall tell your story first," she said, when at length they could speak. And so he did. But his head was so full of the Lady of the Shell that he forgot to say anything about the fox. And it was well that he had forgotten, for when the princess had poured forth her own adventures, she ended up by speaking of all she owed to the little white fox. "You cannot even guess the care he took of me in the little palace, but though nothing could exceed his kindness, I saw by his eyes that there was something he wanted me to give him, but I could not tell what. Alas, the day came that I learnt it to my cost. I had hidden the collar in a thick bush, lest the fox should catch sight of it and be scared away as the other animals had been. But one day, when we were in the garden, the sun happened to shine straight on it, and he sprang towards it with every sign of delight. He was about to seize it between his teeth, when it closed with a loud noise. The fox fled away with a piercing scream, and though I have sought him far and wide, I have never seen him since. I was here when you flung the skin into the cinders, and no doubt in my hurry to escape, the collar must have dropped from me. Ah, dear brother, she continued with tears in her eyes, I can no longer live without my beloved fox. Help me, I entreat you, to find him. So great was her grief that the prince dared not tell her what sad fate had overtaken the poor little animal, and trusted that time might soothe her. He assured her that he would go with her wherever she desired if she would grant him this one day to spend on the seashore. And with this the princess was forced to be content. The prince was standing on the rock, looking out towards the lovely island, and straining his eyes to see the white sail once more, when frightful shrieks from the wood a little way off caused him to hasten with all his speed in that direction. He soon perceived a knight on horseback with a bow slung to his back, struggling to lift a woman onto his saddle. The knight's surprise at the sight of a man in this desolate spot caused him to drop the woman's arm, and she rushed to take shelter behind her defender, who, to his amazement, then recognized his stepmother. "How did you come here?" he asked coldly, more than half regretting that he had not left her to her fate. But she read what was in his heart, and fell on her knees before him. "Oh, forgive me my wickedness," she cried, "for indeed I have repented of it long ago and come to the aid of your father, who has been sorely smitten by that mad archduke from whom you have just saved me. There is no time to pursue him," she added, as the prince started at the sound of the vanishing hoofs. And as they pushed their way along the path, she told him all that had happened since they had last met. "From the moment that the king knew of my cruelty to your sister," said she, "he vowed he would never see me again, and left the court in search of you both. I followed him secretly, but not being able to gain any tidings of him, consulted the mother of sheaths, who took me to rest in that island where the palm trees are waving. There she showed me a lovely princess who, under a spell, was forced daily to take the form of a crocodile, and when the dreaded moment arrived, the skin appeared before her, and shudder as she might, some unseen power impelled her to wrap herself in it and plunge into the sea. It is to this island I am leading you, but first we must find your sister, for on her presence hangs the life of the white fox, if indeed he is not dead already." "The white fox!" exclaimed the prince. "What do you know of him?" "Not much," answered the queen, "but since I arrived on the island he was always with us and charmed us all. Yesterday we missed him, but in the evening a little boat drifted up on the sands, and in it lay the fox, covered with blood. While his wounds were being tended in the palace with all the care imaginable, I set out to consult a wizard who told me that I must enter the skiff and seek for the prince and princess of Lombardy, and that if, in 24 hours, I could bring them into the presence of the fox, his life would be saved. On a rock along the beach, I found your father with an arrow through his shoulder, from the bow of his cousin, the mad archduke, who was drawing another from his quiver, destined for me, when I fled into the forest." "My father so near!" cried the prince, We must return and seek him, and also look for my sister." They found her in the grotto, with her father's head in her lap, trying vainly to staunch his wounds. Between them they contrived to carry him to the boat, which sailed swiftly towards the island. On the way, the prince gently broke to his sister the sad state of the white fox. "Take me to him," she said, as soon as the boat touched the island. And in silence the queen went down the path to the palace. The white fox was lying on a soft mattress in front of a fire, his eyes closed, and a look on his face which told that death was not far distant. But he knew somehow that the princess was near him, and opened his eyes and wagged his tail feebly. The princess burst into sobs and tears, till a hand on her shoulder checked her. "Why do you waste the few moments that are left you in this manner?" asked the governor of the island sternly. "Place the collar you wear round his neck and he will be cured at once, but you must act quickly." The princess seemed turned to stone as she listened. "The collar!" she gasped. "But I have not got it. I lost it in the forest." And the 1,000 sheaths with which the walls were hung took up the cry, "The collar is lost! The collar is lost!" "What collar are you talking about?" asked the king, who was lying on another bed, with the physicians bending over him. "Here is one that I picked up among some cinders before that madman shot me. Perhaps it may be the one you want, or, at all events, it may do as well." And he signed to an attendant to take the collar from the pocket of his velvet jerkin. The princess leapt forward with joy at the sight of the precious thing, and snatching it from the hand of the man, she placed it round the neck of the fox. All present held their breath as they watched what was happening, and what did happen was that his legs grew longer and longer, and his nose grew shorter and shorter. The fox was gone, and in his stead there lay Perarthrites, in a coat of thick white fur. But though the Prince of Lombardy was rejoiced to see his friend and cousin again, his heart still bled for the beautiful lady who had vanished so mysteriously. His face was so troubled that the governor of the island marked it and asked what was the matter. "Oh, help me if you can," cried the prince. "The thought of the sufferings that the enchanted nymph may be undergoing tortures me." "They are far worse than you can imagine," gravely replied the governor. "But if you still possess your comb, you may yet relieve her of them." "Ah, that is well," he continued, as the prince quickly drew the comb from its case. "Now follow me." Not only the prince, but everyone else followed, and the governor led them down a long gallery to a heavy iron door, which flew open at its own accord. But what a sight met the prince's eyes! The lady whom he had last beheld in peerless beauty was sitting in a chair wrapped in flames, which were twisting like hair about her head. Her face was swollen and red. Her mouth was open as if gasping for breath. Only her arms and neck were as lovely as ever in their whiteness. "This is your doing," said the governor to the prince. "You brought her to this when you burnt the crocodile's skin. Now try if, by combing, you can soothe her agony." At the first touch of the comb, the flames became suddenly extinguished. At the second, the look of pain vanished from the face, and it shrank into its usual size. At the third, she rose from the chair, lovelier than she ever was before, and flung herself into the arms of her brother Perarthrites. After this, there was nothing more to be done but to marry the two couples as fast as possible. And when the wedding was over, Perarthrites and his bride returned to Placenza, and Ferrandina and her husband to Lombardy, and they all lived happily till they died. Once upon a time there lived in Hindustan 2 kings whose countries bordered upon each other. But, as they were rivals in wealth and power, and one was a Hindu Raja and the other a Mohammedan Badshah, they were not good friends at all. In order, however, to escape continual quarrels, the Raja and the Badshah had drawn up an agreement, stamped and signed, declaring that if any of their subjects, from the least to the greatest, crossed the boundary between the 2 kingdoms, he might be seized and punished. One morning the Badshah and his chief wazir, or prime minister, were just about to begin their morning's work over the affairs of the kingdom, and the Badshah had taken up a pen and was cutting it to his liking with a sharp knife, when the knife slipped and cut off the tip of his finger. "Oh, hey, wazir!" cried the king. "I've cut the tip of my finger off." "That is good hearing," said the wazir in answer. "Insolent one," exclaimed the king. "Do you take pleasure in the misfortunes of others, and in mine also? Take him away, my guards, and put him in the court prison until I have time to punish him as he deserves." Instantly the officers in attendance seized upon the luckless wazir and dragged him out of the king's presence towards the narrow doorway, through which unhappy criminals were wont to be led to prison or execution. As the door opened to receive him, the wazir muttered something into his great white beard which the soldiers could not hear. "What said the rascal?" shouted the angry king. "He says, 'He thanks your majesty,'" replied one of the jailers. And at his words the king stared at the closing door in anger and amazement. "He must be mad," he cried, "for he is grateful, not only for the misfortunes of others, but for his own. Surely something has turned his head." Now the king was very fond of his old wazir, and although the court physician came and bound up his injured finger with cool and healing ointment, and soothed the pain, he could not soothe the soreness of the king's heart, nor could any of all his ministers and courtiers, who found his majesty very cross all the day long. Early next morning the king ordered his horse and declared that he would go hunting. Instantly all was bustle and preparation in stable and hall, and by the time he was ready a score of ministers and huntsmen stood ready to mount and accompany him. But to their astonishment the king would have none of them. Indeed, he glared at them so fiercely that they were glad to leave him. So away and away he wandered, over field and through forest, so moody and thoughtful that many a fat buck and gaudy pheasant escaped without notice, and so careless was he whither he was going, that he strayed without perceiving it over into the Raja's territory. and only discovered the fact when, suddenly, men stepped from all sides out of a thicket, and there was nothing left but surrender. Then the poor Badshah was seized and bound and taken to the Raja's prison, thinking most of the time of his wazir, who was suffering a similar fate, and wishing that, like the wazir, he could feel that there was something to give thanks for. That night the Raja held a special council to consider what should be done to his rival who had thus given himself into his hands. All the Brahmins were sent for, fat priests who understood all about everything, and what days were lucky and what unlucky. And whilst all the rest of the Raja's counselors were offering him different advice until he was nearly crazy with anger and indecision, the chief Brahmin was squatting in a corner, figuring out sums and signs to himself with an admiring group of lesser priests around him. At last he arose and advanced towards the throne. "Well," said the Raja anxiously, "what have you to advise?" "A very unlucky day," exclaimed the chief Brahmin. "Oh, a very unlucky day. The god Devi is full of wrath and commands that tomorrow you must chop off this Badshah's head and offer it in to him in sacrifice." "Ah, well," said the Raja, "let it be done. I leave it to you to carry out the sentence." And he bowed to the priests and left the room. Before dawn, great preparations were being made for a grand festival in honor of the great idol Devi. Hundreds of banners waved, hundreds of drummers drummed, hundreds of singers chanted chants, hundreds of priests, well washed and anointed, performed their sacred rites, whilst the Raja sat, nervous and ill at ease, amongst hundreds of courtiers and servants, wishing it were all well over. At last the time came for the sacrifice to be offered, and the poor Badshah was led out bound to have his head chopped off. The chief Brahmin came along with a smile on his face and a big sword in his hand, when suddenly he noticed that the Badshah's finger was tied up in a bit of rag. Instantly he dropped the sword, and with his eyes starting out of his head with excitement, pounced upon the rag and tore it off, and there he saw that the tip of his victim's finger was missing. At this he got very red and angry indeed, and he led the Badshah up to where the Raja sat, wondering. "Behold, O Raja," he said, "this sacrifice is useless, the tip of his finger is gone. A sacrifice is no sacrifice unless it is complete." And he began to weep with rage and mortification. But instead of wailing likewise, the Raja gave a sigh of relief and answered, "Well, that settles the matter. If it had been anyone else, I should not have minded. But somehow, a king and all, well, it doesn't seem quite right to sacrifice a king." And with that he jumped up, and with his jeweled dagger cut the Badshah's cords, and marched with him out of the temple back to the palace. After having bathed and refreshed his guest, the Raja loaded him with gifts, and himself accompanied him with a large escort as far as the frontier between their kingdoms, where, amidst salutes and great rejoicings, they tore up the old agreement and drew up another in which each king promised welcome and safe conduct to any of the other's people, from the least to the greatest, who came over the border on any errand whatever. And so they embraced, and each went his own way. When the Badshah got home that very evening, he sent for his imprisoned wazir. "Well, O wazir," he said when the old man had been brought before him, "what think you has been happening to me?" "How can a man in prison know what is happening outside it?" answered the wazir Dot. Then the Badshah told him all his adventures, and when he had reached the end he added, "I have made up my mind as a token of gratitude for my escape to pardon you freely if you will tell me why you gave thanks when I cut off the tip of my finger." "Sire," replied the old wazir, "am I not right in thinking that it was a very lucky thing for you that you did cut off the tip of your finger, for otherwise you would certainly have lost your head? And to lose a scrap of one's finger is surely the least of the two evils." "Very true," answered the king, touching his head as he spoke, as if to make quite certain that it was still there. "But yet, why did you likewise give thanks when I put you into prison?" "I gave thanks," said the wazir, "because it is good always to give thanks. And had I known that my being in prison was to prevent the god Devi claiming me instead of your majesty as a perfect offering, I should have given greater thanks still." In the great country far away south, through which flows the river Nile, there lived a king who had an only child called Samba. Now, from the time that Samba could walk, he showed signs of being afraid of everything, and as he grew bigger, he became more and more frightened. At first, his father's friends made light of it and said to each other, "It is strange to see a boy of our race running into a hut at the trumpeting of an elephant, and trembling with fear if a lion cub half his size comes near him, but after all, he is only a baby, and when he is older he will be as brave as the rest." "Yes, he is only a baby," answered the king, who overheard them. "It will be all right by and by." But somehow he sighed as he said it, and the men looked at him and made no reply. The years passed away, and Samba had become a tall and strong youth. He was good-natured and pleasant, and was liked by all, and if during his father's hunting parties he was seldom to be seen in any place of danger, he was too great a favorite for much to be said. "When the king holds the feast and declares him to be his heir, he will cease to be a child," murmured the rest of the people as they had done before, and on the day of the ceremony their hearts beat gladly and they cried to each other, "It is Samba, Samba, whose chin is above the heads of other men, who will defend us against the tribes of the robbers." Not many weeks after, the dwellers in the village awoke to find that during the night their herds had been driven away, and their herdsmen carried off into slavery by their enemies. Now was the time for Samba to show the brave spirit that had come to him with his manhood, and to ride forth at the head of the warriors of his race. But Samba could nowhere be found, and a party of the avengers went on their way without him. It was many days later before he came back, with his head held high and a tale of a lion which he had tracked to its lair and killed at the risk of his own life. A little while earlier and his people would have welcomed his story and believed it all, but now it was too late. "Samba the coward!" cried a voice from the crowd. and the name stuck to him. Even the very children shouted it at him, and his father did not spare him. At length he could bear it no longer, and made up his mind to leave his own land for another, where peace had reigned since the memory of man. So early next morning he slipped out to the king's stables, and choosing the quietest horse he could find, he rode away northwards. Never as long as he lived did Samba forget the terrors of that journey. He could hardly sleep at night for dread of the wild beasts that might be lurking behind every rock or bush, while by day the distant roar of a lion would cause him to start so violently that he almost fell from his horse. A dozen times he was on the point of turning back, and it was not the terror of the mocking words and scornful laughs that kept him from doing so, but the terror lest he should be forced to take part in their wars. Therefore he held on, and deeply thankful he felt when the walls of a city, larger than he had ever dreamed of, rose before him. Drawing himself up to his full height, he rode proudly through the gate and past the palace, where, as was her custom, the princess was sitting on the terrace roof, watching the bustle in the street below. "That is a gallant figure," thought she, as Samba, mounted on his big black horse, steered his way skillfully among the crowds, and beckoning to a slave, she ordered him to go and meet the stranger, and ask him who he was and whence he came. "O princess, he is the son of a king, and heir to a country which lies near the great river," answered the slave, when he had returned from questioning Samba. And the princess, on hearing this news, summoned her father, and told him that if she was not allowed to wed the stranger, she would die unmarried. Like many other fathers, the king could refuse his daughter nothing, and besides, she had rejected so many suitors already that he was quite alarmed lest no man should be good enough for her. Therefore, after a talk with Samba, who charmed him by his good humor and pleasant ways, he gave his consent, and 3 days later the wedding feast was celebrated with the utmost splendor. The princess was very proud of her tall, handsome husband, and for some time she was quite content that he should pass the days with her under the palm trees, telling her the stories that she loved, or amusing her with tales of the manners and customs of his country, which were so different to those of her own. But by and by this was not enough. She wanted other people to be proud of him too, and one day she said, "I really almost wish that those Moorish thieves from the north would come on one of their robbing expeditions. I should love so to see you ride out at the head of our men to chase them home again. Ah, how happy I should be when the city rang with your noble deeds." She looked lovingly at him as she spoke, but to her surprise his face grew dark and he answered hastily, "Never speak to me again of the Moors or of war. It was to escape from them that I fled from my own land, and at the first word of invasion I should leave you forever." "How funny you are," cried she, breaking into a laugh. "The idea of anyone as big as you being afraid of a Moor. But still, you mustn't say those things to anyone except me, or they might think you were in earnest." Not very long after this, when the people of the city were holding a great feast outside the walls of the town, a body of Moors, who had been in hiding for days, drove off all the sheep and goats which were peacefully feeding on the slopes of a hill. Directly the loss was discovered, which was not for some hours, the king gave orders that the war drum should be beaten, and the warriors assembled in the great square before the palace, trembling with fury at the insult which had been put upon them. Loud were the cries for instant vengeance, and for Samba, son-in-law of the king, to lead them to battle. But shout as they might, Samba never came. And where was he? No further than in a cool dark cellar of the palace, crouching among huge earthenware pots of grain. With a rush of pain at her heart, there his wife found him, and she tried with all her strength to kindle in him a sense of shame, but in vain. Even the thought of the future danger he might run from the contempt of his subjects was as nothing when compared with the risks of the present. "Take off your tunic of mail," said the princess at last, and her voice was so stern and cold that none would have known it. "Give it to me, and hand me besides your helmet, your sword, and your spear." And with many fearful glances to right and to left, Samba stripped off the armor inlaid with gold, the property of the king's son-in-law. Silently his wife took, one by one, the pieces from him, and fastened them on her with firm hands, never even glancing at the tall form of her husband who had slunk back to his corner. When she had fastened the last buckle and lowered her visor, she went out, and mounting Samba's horse, gave the signal to the warriors to follow. Now, although the princess was much shorter than her husband, she was a tall woman, and the horse which she rode was likewise higher than the rest, so that when the men caught sight of the gold-inlaid suit of chain armor, they did not doubt that Samba was taking his rightful place, and cheered him loudly. The princess bowed in answer to their greeting, but kept her visor down, and touching her horse with the spur, she galloped at the head of her troops to charge the enemy. The Moors, who had not expected to be so quickly pursued, had scarcely time to form themselves into battle array, and were speedily put to flight. Then the little troop of horsemen returned to the city, where all sung the praises of Samba, their leader. The instant they reached the palace, the princess flung her reins to a groom and disappeared up a side staircase, by which she could, unseen, enter her own rooms. Here she found Samba lying idly on a heap of mats, but he raised his head uneasily as the door opened and looked at his wife, not feeling sure how she might act towards him. However, he need not have been afraid of harsh words. She merely unbuttoned her armor as fast as possible, and bade him put it on with all speed. Samba obeyed, not daring to ask any questions, and when he had finished, the princess told him to follow her, and led him on to the flat roof of the house, below which a crowd had gathered, cheering lustily. Samba, the king's son-in-law, Samba, the bravest of the brave, where is he? Let him show himself. And when Samba did show himself, the shouts and applause became louder than ever. "See how modest he is! He leaves the glory to others," cried they. and Samba only smiled and waved his hand and said nothing. Out of all the mass of people assembled there to do honor to Samba, one alone there was who did not shout and praise with the rest. This was the princess's youngest brother, whose sharp eyes had noted certain things during the fight which recalled his sister much more than they did her husband. Under promise of secrecy, he told his suspicions to the other princes, but only got laughed at, and was bidden to carry his dreams elsewhere. "Well, well," answered the boy, "we shall see who is right. But the next time we give battle to the Moors, I will take care to place a private mark on our commander." In spite of their defeat, not many days after, the Moors sent a fresh body of troops to steal some cattle, and again Samba's wife dressed herself in her husband's armor, and rode out at the head of the avenging column. This time the combat was fiercer than before, and in the thick of it her youngest brother drew near, and gave his sister a slight wound on the leg. At the moment she paid no heed to the pain, which indeed she scarcely felt. But when the enemy had been put to flight and the little band returned to the palace, faintness suddenly overtook her, and she could hardly stagger up the staircase to her own apartments. "I am wounded," she cried, sinking down on the mats where he had been lying. "But do not be anxious, it is really nothing. You have only got to wound yourself slightly in the same spot, and no one will guess that it was I and not you who were fighting." "What?" cried Samba, his eyes nearly starting from his head in surprise and terror. "Can you possibly imagine that I should agree to anything so useless and painful? Why, I might as well have gone to fight myself." "Ah, I ought to have known better indeed," answered the princess, in a voice that seemed to come from a long way off. But quick as thought, the moment Samba turned his back, she pierced one of his bare legs with a spear. He gave a loud scream and staggered backwards from astonishment much more than from pain. But before he could speak, his wife had left the room and had gone to seek the medicine man of the palace. "My husband has been wounded," said she when she had found him. "Come and tend him with speed, for he is faint from loss of blood." And she took care that more than one person heard her words, so that all that day the people pressed up to the gate of the palace, asking for news of their brave champion. "You see," observed the king's eldest sons, who had visited the room where Samba lay groaning, "you see, O wise young brother, that we were right and you were wrong about Samba, and that he really did go into the battle." But the boy answered nothing, and only shook his head doubtfully. It was only 2 days later that the Moors appeared for the third time, and though the herds had been tethered in a new and safer place, they were promptly carried off as before. "For," said the Moors to each other, "the tribe will never think of our coming back so soon when they have beaten us so badly." When the drum sounded to assemble all the fighting men, the princess rose and sought her husband. "Samba," cried she, "my wound is worse than I thought. I can scarcely walk and could not mount my horse without help. For today, then, I cannot do your work, so you must go instead of me." "What nonsense!" exclaimed Samba. "I never heard of such a thing. Why, I might be wounded or even killed. You have 3 brothers. The king can choose one of them." "They are all too young," replied his wife. "The men would not obey them. But if, indeed, you will not go, at least you can help me harness my horse." And to this, Samba, who was always ready to do anything he was asked when there was no danger about it, agreed readily. So the horse was quickly harnessed, and when it was done, the princess said, "Now ride the horse to the place of meeting outside the gates, and I will join you by a shorter way, and will change places with you." Samba, who loved riding in times of peace, mounted as she had told him, and when he was safe in the saddle, his wife dealt the horse a sharp cut with her whip, and he dashed off through the town and through the ranks of the warriors who were waiting for him. Instantly the whole place was in motion. Samba tried to check his steed, but he might as well have sought to stop the wind, and it seemed no more than a few minutes before they were grappling hand to hand with the Moors. Then a miracle happened. Samba, the coward, the skulker, the terrified, no sooner found himself pressed hard, unable to escape, than something sprang into life within him, and he fought with all his might. And when a man of his size and strength begins to fight, he generally fights well. That day the victory was really owing to Samba, and the shouts of the people were louder than ever. When he returned, bearing with him the sword of the Moorish chief, the old king pressed him in his arms and said, "Oh, my son, how can I ever show you how grateful I am for this splendid service?" But Samba, who was good and loyal when fear did not possess him, answered straightly, "My father, it is to your daughter and not to me to whom thanks are due, for it is she who has turned the coward that I was into a brave man." And now as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.